Rabbi, can I ask you, where can you find the movie?
I think it's on YouTube.
It's on YouTube?
Well, yeah. Welcome, everybody, to our Wednesday study session, which we haven't thought of the name yet after 9.5 years. Sheila was just asking where we could find the movie The Merchant of Venice, the one with...
No, The Weight of Ink.
The one more time?
Weight of Ink.
Oh, no, no, we're talking about, we're not doing Weight of Ink today. We're doing Jews in literature. Remember we changed it. No,
I thought you were doing it said The Weight of Ink.
Yeah, we changed it when that's an old, we had prepared to do it, but a couple of weeks ago we decided it was too long of a novel to use with such short notice. So we had switched it to The Merchant of Venice, but then decided to talk a little bit more about Jews in literature. And there's an incredible amount of Merchant of Venice, and obviously Charles Dickens, Oliver Twist are probably the most famous. But we're going to look at a wide range of Jews who have been portrayed in literature. And again, it's an incredible array. What we're going to first take a moment to say, we're not going to really talk that much about the 20th century and we're not going to talk that much about Jewish writers, because I feel like Jewish writers have an inside view that others didn't. And we're really going to look at stereotypes and how Jews are portrayed from the outside. However, we could easily talk about Jewish portrayals by Jewish authors in the 20th century. We've kind of done that already. But again, if we're going to go back in time to the 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, I think we're going to limit it to books for this purpose that were not written by Jews, if that's all right with everybody.
We're going to talk about Chaucer?
Yeah, Chaucer's definitely on the list. So let's first talk about the history of Jews in this type of stereotypical Western literature. Now, again, we have to go back and make sure people understand the literature we're talking about does not go as far back as many people think. We're not going back to the 900s or 800s or 700s. The literature we're talking about has certainly roots in an older culture, but the books we're going to talk about really are talking 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th century, when literature really starts to take hold in Western Europe. And that's what we're going to talk mainly about, although we do know, obviously, that the stereotypes in Jewish literature, are based upon things that came before, such as the Bible. But I think a lot of people think that for 1,500 years before the year 1500, that there had been this mass number of books written with Jewish characters who were stereotypical of what we think of from, Shylock and from Fagin. And the truth is that is not the case. There's very little literature before this age of Shakespeare in which we see Jewish characters portrayed in any way at all. And so really the anti-Semitism we think about probably will be just for the last millennium. And a lot of it has to do with the Crusades and, of course, the blood libel of the 11th century. That's probably the origins, although the literature is much later on in reality. So the literature we see from the 13th century about Jews is often by Jewish writers talking about Chelm and funny things like that, the wandering Jew type of thing, which is anti-Semitic in some ways, but we don't really see the major works until probably the 12th. It's really the 13th century. So let's talk about, yes.
Don't you think that has to do with, among other things, the fact that there was really no literature?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. 100%.
Of any sort before Gutenberg anyway.
And I think that's the main reason. Yeah. And again, we don't see, and there was literature of this age, it's just not in the Western world, it's in the Muslim world, in the Chinese world, in which Jews, although were second-class citizens in the Muslim world, they didn't have the same stereotypes at all about Jews. And actually, they were treated probably as well as any other non-Muslim for a very long time. But once the Western world woke up and started to become what we know as the dominant intellectual culture of the age, that's when we see. And what we're going to see is, of course, as we know, the great ironies. And of course, the greatest irony of this literature of all is that in 1290, Jews were kicked out of England. And there were no Jews in England from 1290 to 1656-ish when Oliver Cromwell. And so we think about some of the most prominent Jewish stereotypical characters are written in England during this period, which is the irony, because there's a good chance the writers had actually never met a Jew, probably very likely, and they'd only heard about them. So they had become almost mythical in a case. The debate we're going to be engaging in about this is one that still goes on, and that is the debate between why are there stereotypical. We're going to talk about positive Jewish characters as well, but as we know, there's a lot of negative stereotypical characters, and we're going to look at also the great debate is why are they there? Are all of these negative stereotypes because in the age there was a lot of anti-Semitism, or was it that these characters had just become stock characters that were just part of life, even when there wasn't that much anti-Semitism? And you can make a case for both. How can you have anti-Semitism in England during the age of Chaucer and Shakespeare when there's not a single Jew in the country? How can you have it? On the other hand, you still had anti-Semitic writings in other countries where Jews still existed. So is this a stock character type of thing where it remains the same character, or does it really teach us about the age itself and how they looked at Jews? And we'll talk about some of the more famous characters, some of the ones that are not as famous, and then we'll look at some of the positive characters, but then we'll also look at some of the reasons that these positive characters were brought to light. And a lot of people think that they were for ulterior motives to do that. So any questions or thoughts before we begin? This is a really interesting subject. And of course, some of you may have actually read all of these books. I have not. I've read some of them. I'm probably going to read a lot of them now that I've kind of studied on them. So let's go to The Merchant of Venice. We might as well start with probably the most famous, or at least one of the two or three most famous, of course, Shylock. Now, Shylock, as we know, has become the poster boy for the money-lending Jew. And yet there is a lot of debate as to whether the anti-Semitism is prevalent, or even some believe he paints Shylock as a positive character, which is ironic because it doesn't seem like that to everyone else. But how does this miserly Jew, this moneylender, father of this woman, become such a stigma for Jews? Now, first of all, let's go. Anybody want to go over the story of The Merchant of Venice? All right, that I will be happy to. So it's basically a play in which a wealthy person who is no longer wealthy borrows money from a friend who is backed by a Jewish person who is Shylock. And when this person is not able to pay back the loan, thinking that his ships have gone down, he asks for more time. But Shylock says famously, no, you have to pay me what the contract states, which is
pound of flesh.
Pound of flesh. So it's a pound of flesh. Certainly we know that phrase today. I'm not sure if that phrase was initiated by Shakespeare or if he had heard it before. And so they go to court. And of course, this Jew who has really had some terrible things happen to him recently, refuses more money, refuses anything else but a pound of flesh, until, of course, a lawyer for the other side, which is secretly somebody else, comes in and says, well, how can you get a pound of flesh? It has to be the exact amount, and you can't get a pound of flesh exactly without hurting somebody. And so anyway, in the end, it turns out that the tables are turned on Shylock, and he is the one who was at risk of losing his fortune and losing his life. And of course, this brings him to the most famous soliloquy from a Jew in Shakespeare, which is, of course, the really famous one. If you guys may have heard of it, if you haven't, that's okay. But where it says, am I not, basically saying, am I not like everybody else? Do I not bleed when you prick me? When they're discussing what they should do with him, he's not killed in it, but he actually pretty much loses. He has to give up Judaism as one of his penalties. Michael.
Oh, no, I'm just moving my hands.
So now the question is, this Shylock character, some would say he's obviously the negative stereotype of the wealthy Jew moneylender. Others would say this last speech of his, which is so well known, teaches us that he's just a regular human being who's had some troubled issues and who's Jewish, and so has been forced into this life where he has no other alternatives. As we know, so many Jews were in money lending because that was one of the few jobs they were allowed to have. And so when you see Shylock, you see this miserable character who's miserly, although he does have a love for his daughter, which is important, and who is a trickster, who is trying to take advantage of this poor, innocent, wealthy person who's lost his money with this pound of flesh thing, before the tables are turned by a much smarter person who is Christian and a woman who ends up tricking him into losing almost everything. And so the debate over this character is the biggest debate in all of literature when it comes to a Jewish person. Was Shakespeare anti-Semitic? Was he using a stock character? Was he just doing what people were already doing and not even thinking about it? Is Shylock the product of someone he met or heard of when he was abroad, or somebody coming back from abroad? Or is it still express the feelings of people in England in the 16th century? So more than, 200 years or 150, 200 years later, 250 or plus years later, they still have this anti-Semitic feeling, even though there hasn't been a Jew in the country. Can you imagine that? 250 years later. So this is 2021. So 25, 21. Let's put it that way. That would be too much. It would be 2271. The year 2271. People having the same anti-view as we do today, 250 years in the future. It's almost unbelievable, Stuart.
I wonder, I know we're not going back, and I agree, we oughtn't go back to earlier literature, but I wonder if Shakespeare perhaps wasn't really picking up tropes that were in the earlier literature, because one has to consider what Shakespeare would have been reading, and all that would have been available to him in a large sense with the church writings from much earlier. And they're essentially going back to the beginning of the Christian Testament. To the Gospels, we have the story of Jewish moneylenders.
And that, I think, is a really important idea to think, where does this come from? It is obviously, a lot of it is based on the biblical text that they are reading, both what they call the Old Testament and the New Testament. You read of Herod, who kills children, and who is some sort of connection to killing Christ. You read about the Jewish mutilator and the usurer in the Bible. So there is both of these already in the Bible. This idea of the Jewish businessman who is vulgar and the Jew kills people, like a kind of a mixture of both. What's really interesting, and I think we would agree with you, is the fact that the Bible's written almost 1,000 years, more than 1,000 years before. And so they're basing these characters on something from 1,000 years earlier, which you have not seen, at least very many writings that we have seen since. Now, maybe in church writings, but certainly not in literature. So how did this viewpoint hold up? Now, there are short stories and characters that you see this before. You see the Wandering Jew, you see Hugh of Lincoln, you see the Jew of Malta, although that's around the same time. And so you do see some examples of these things, but how does it become such a part of society 1,000 years later? It is an incredible statement that this type of stigma can stay with you or disappear for 900 years and come back. Flossie.
People in seeing this, I know how I felt, but I know I'm bringing the history of being a Jew. Didn't they see what he went through? We saw him spat on. We saw him called dog. We saw him humiliated. He was forced to live in a ghetto. All that is not brought up. It is that he was forced into an occupation that they didn't want to dirty their hands and didn't want part of. He's doing it to exist. And yes, he built up revenge, and that's part of showing with what had built up by this Antonio. But no one feels, hey, look what he's gone through to feel this way. I mean, I don't just look that there was this hungry Jew just for money, because even when he had the opportunity to get the money, that's not really what he wanted.
And what did he want instead?
The revenge that
Exactly.
Okay, so, but people, the average person seeing, don't see what he went through to get to that point.
And that's an excellent, because there's debate about this. Some would believe that Shakespeare is almost demonstrating that the Jew in the story learned revenge from the Christians. Others would say that it's a natural Jewish inclination. Others would say is that it's definitely a stock character. The Jew is the bad guy. I don't know any Jew. It's like me putting somebody from Mongolia as the bad guy. It doesn't affect anybody in my neighborhood. I'm not insulting anybody I know. It's Jew is the outsider and very easily can be used in this way to demonstrate the ills of society. Is Shylock the example of a Jewish bad guy or a bad guy in general? And that even a bad guy has feelings, that even a bad guy is human. And so this is really an interesting case because, again, I'm sorry, I just put on Do Not Disturb. Shakespeare didn't, for all we know, if he did know Jews, there were no Jews in his area. There was no way for them to have this type of stereotype in their neighborhoods. Certainly they could have seen it abroad because there were Jews living in places, especially like the big Jewish community in Amsterdam at that time. But there were no Jews in France, no Jews in England. And so it's really an incredible debate as to how anti-Semitic it is versus it's just the stock character. You know, everybody makes fun of, you know, when I come from Texas, everybody made fun of Texas A&M, the Aggies. They had books of Aggie jokes. And a lot of people probably didn't even know Aggies were representative of Texas A&M. They just knew those jokes. Flossie.
Where did most of the Jews at this time live? You're saying Amsterdam? Well, that's the Netherlands. Okay.
The Jews that they would have had access to, again, the Jewish community in Eastern Europe, Poland, Lithuania was already probably the largest. And it had started to grow in the 13th, 14th century. Certainly by the 17th and 18th century, it would be by far the largest. There were Jews living in the Ottoman Empire still. Still Jews living in Amsterdam, still Jews living in North Africa, smatterings of Jews throughout European countries that had not banned them, such as Spain, Portugal, England, and France. So there were Jews all around, but this stereotype was a particular stereotype. You don't see the stereotype, for instance, in the Muslim world as much, or in the other places, just in the Western world. Larry.
Yeah, I think a couple of things. One is that Shakespeare classified this as a comedy,
Yeah.
which is very interesting because it really lends to the idea of taking a stock character and making him the comic villain in the piece. And in general, a person that's a miser, a person that is very rigid in his ways, was the guy you would usually make fun of. The title is The Merchant of Venice, not the Jew of Venice. So it has nothing to do with, the title at least has nothing to do with Shylock. And Shylock only appears in 5 scenes, though five very, very compelling scenes. But to most of the people who were watching it at the time, it was probably viewed, according to most of the historians at the time, it was probably viewed as a comedy, as a romantic comedy of how these young people basically undo their fathers. And the whole scene in which the caskets, the three boxes, she is kind of devising a way, Portia is devising a way in which she tries to select her own husband, basically, by maybe influencing who picks the caskets. And she makes fun of all of the suitors. All of the people that are outsiders are always made fun of in this play. The people who are kind of strange, and I think it comes to what Venice was at the time. Now, Venice, as strange as it was probably the only place in Europe where Jews were welcomed, which is a really, really strange thing. And it wasn't the uniform Jewish community. There were Jews that came from Constantinople, from the Eastern Empire. As a matter of fact, the 2 suitors that Portia has are of Aragon, which was Spain, and she has the suitor from Morocco. So she has the 2 suitors from the 2 major empires of the world, but she also makes fun of the French suitors, of the German suitors, and all of the other suitors that are there. So these are basically stock characters. I'm just portraying what many historians think. These are really stock characters. And what Shakespeare often does is he always gives you 2 sides to the story. So he gives you the good and the bad. It's almost like the Willy Loman kind of guy. He's a bad guy in that he, in Death of a Salesman, and that, you feel sorry for him, yet, he's got a lot of flaws, and he shouldn't be treated that way. But Venice is a very, very strange city in which Jews are welcomed, but they have to be in their own ghetto. They have certain freedoms and they have certain things. And I think why does Shakespeare pick Venice? He picks Venice for this play, and he picks Venice also for Othello. And in Othello, he also takes a character who is not Venetian, who happens to be a converted Christian, who was also a Muslim, a Turk, to fight against the Turks. So he's basically picking outsiders here to show that these were people that were sort of welcomed into the community, but Venice is a republic, and Venice is a place where commerce is the most important thing. And can people get along in a community where basically they hate each other, where basically they despise each other and have to do business with each other and are set aside? And it's the kind of thing like, yeah, you're welcome in my community, but you can't marry my daughter, like Othello and Desdemona. He's always looked upon. And I think to a large extent, that is what Shakespeare is doing. He's showing us what is a very, very unusual community in Europe that he's probably heard about. People from Venice had traveled to the Globe Theater, had probably seen him, had seen his plays. He had probably even met them. There's no evidence he had ever been to Venice or to any of these places, but he probably knew of most of the merchants. As a matter of fact, at the very beginning of the play, they talk about the ships that Antonio has, and they're going all over the world. They're going to Mexico. They're going to South America. He gives you a litany of all of these places. And this is 1600 or 1596, basically, when the play they think was written. And these are ships that are traveling all over the world. Venice is the commerce of the world. And I think what Shakespeare has is a larger view of the fact that Shylock is a comic character, but he's really borders on the tragic. But the real thing is in the play, as most people at the time would have seen, remember how the play ends? The play ends with Act 5, where basically after the Shylock scene, which is really the most dramatic scene in the play, where he, was forced to Christianity, and the pound of flesh scene, and he can't cut exactly the pound of flesh. And then in scene 5, what is it? Portia finally meets Antonio. She finally meets him, and Portia basically takes revenge on Antonio by getting his blessing because of this mix-up with the rings and with other things that take place in the thing there. So it's quite a complicated play. I mean, you could reach so many conclusions from it, but I think the major conclusion that a person would have seen at the time was this young woman who is outsmarting all of the people that she comes in contact with. It's this rebelliousness of the young, and that's why he classifies it really more as a comedy. And I think more people would probably, more of the historians that I've read, kind of use it not as what tragedy of Shylock, but as a comedy of with a stock character, and Shylock happens to be that stock character.
And again, and that's, you can look at it from both sides, although there is debate as to whether it originally was supposed to be called The Jew of Venice. There is a debate that was his actual original title, but they asked him to change it. But yeah, I agree. I mean, again, he mentions Jew one other time in another one of his plays, and it's, again, more of a stock phrase. He Jewed me down, the kind of stock phrase we hear from others. The fact that he never probably met a Jew, it could be that he didn't even realize he was insulting anybody, because he doesn't know a Jew, doesn't even realize it's insulting. Flossie.
I think another thing about the play is the ultimate that here are two Jews, his daughter and he, and they are converting. I mean, at the end, when they give him with the choice, do they look that they're giving him such a gift that here he can become a Christian?
And that's an excellent point. She chooses on her own, but he chooses as opposed to probably, something much worse. So two ways to convert: the right way, in which you choose to do it yourself, or the other way, which is we're going to give you the opportunity to do it, or you can die and go to hell. That's almost what they're saying here. And it's this, of course, is the greatest debate in the Jewish world when it comes to literature, is this character of Shylock. Of course, that last monologue of his is really what creates the debate, because otherwise we could say it's a stock character. He's making fun of him. He's the bad guy. Right. Until at the very end, we see the bad guy says, wait a minute, I'm a human being too. Is Shakespeare's finally saying, listen, Jews are human beings as well. We only talk about them in the sense of they're these money lending killers, but in reality, they're human as well. Michael.
Yeah, I just, the fact that he converts, that's something that, Jews are not supposed to do. And does he do that deliberately? He doesn't have to do it in the play. I mean, he can just leave him for it. But then he shows that he's really not maybe that committed, which again would cast some aspersions on his, qualities as a person. I don't know.
He does have to convert. He's forced to convert or forfeit his life, because under Venetian law, had he not converted, according to the Doge at the time, the Doge gives him the final sentence and says that you have to convert now, or Antonio tells him he has to convert.
Yes. But Larry, what are the three things that, when we sanctify life, but what are the three things that we can give up our life? Conversion is one.
Yes, he could have. Yeah, he relents at the end in that he is not, totally committed to Judaism. in that he does convert. But nonetheless, you talk about Jessica and Lorenzo, the two, Jessica, his daughter. She again is playing a trick on the father. It's the young against the old. It's the young people who are trying to do their own thing, be their own way, and not obey the father. Portia is left with this will of her dead father, who says, I'm going to choose your husband for you. I'm going to choose your husband because he's got to pick the right casket. He's got to pick the right box. I mean, it's kind of overwhelming throughout the whole play that the young people are kind of saddled with the responsibility of their parents, and they are relenting. And they're in this place, apparently, which is a party town. They're in this place of Venice where there's a lot of...
Just like Savannah.
Yeah, like Savannah.
Party town with water.
Right, everything is going on there. Everything is joy, and you've got these two old fogies here who are trying to clamp down on them. And Shylock is a religious kind of guy. He's not into the partying. He's not into even celebrating anything with his friend, the people that he does business with. And I think Shakespeare is kind of fascinated once again with this whole idea of how do you survive in a community that where people hate each other, but they're forced to do business with each other. And is this, it's not a republic. There's no king who can, preside over it. So you have this series of laws. And I think what he's also saying is that sometimes the law gets in the way. Sometimes that you try to obey the law to the strictest, like Shylock does. The covenant is everything. The law is everything. The contract is everything, and yet it can be used against you. And I think it's in a way, it's sort of this ploy against reading too much into religion, that sometimes if you try and be too strict or strict adherence to the law, it can backfire on you. And that people, maybe this is a new way, maybe Venice was being looked on as a new way of people to get together and to live together, even if they have all of these different ideas. Many merchants were coming to Venice from all different quarters of the world. There were, I think, 4 or 5 different Jewish shuls in Venice over the 1600s that were set up by the different parts of the Jewish community. So Venice was not a Ashkenazi. It was not Sephardic. It was it had Ottoman Turks. It had Ottoman Jews. It had people from all over. It was a very, very diverse place, as well as traders from all over the world that were coming to Venice. And how did they live together? And when they didn't like each other, I mean, that was, I think, part of what you're seeing here.
Stuart, you wanted to say something? And then
Yeah,
Michael?
I think one of the things that Larry talked about is this idea of the older versus the younger generation. And I don't see that as an issue of Judaism per se, or of that time per se. Indeed, I think that struggle has been going on unsuccessfully for the young until about 1970. And we are now in a generation, maybe it's our age, our personal age, that makes us think this way. But this is the first time I've seen it, that the young people are really the people who are dominating. We've had parents dominating children essentially from the start, and children rebelling, right from Noah after the flood. We've seen that same kind of argument. So I'm not sure that that holds up in any way toward anti-Semitism. I think that's perhaps just a general characteristic that has gone on. If I may have one other, quick thing. We're not talking about the general characteristic of prejudice, that there is this distinction between what some call punching up and punching down. Prejudice against people who are better off than us, and prejudice against people who are at a lower level than us. Economically, in this whole time period, really, I guess from the time of Christ on, because of church law and the limitation of professions, Jews had been economically advantaged very much
Mhm.
compared to others. You don't hear about any other people lending to nobility except Jews. And I wonder how much of this prejudice is just punching up idea. I feel better by degrading the person who is better off than I am.
That's a good point. Do you feel better doing it, or is it just something that people do automatically that you don't even have a second thought as to? And the old versus the young, again, that's a whole nother subject, because today, obviously, people live so much longer, but also because of technology, younger people have a very big advantage when you grow up with it, as opposed to people who learn it as they get older. But those are all excellent questions, and that's why this play has become endured so long. Not only the Jewish, that's why Shakespeare's plays endure, because of all these questions, young, old, stereotypes, traditions that are no longer valid. And think about this, the idea, they're already questioning the traditions. He does it in other places, of young people marrying who their parents tell them to. And that tradition is going to go on until the 20th century, and yet they're already questioning it in the 16th. Flossie. And you're still on mute, Flossie.
Yeah, am I off
Yeah.
You're
now?
on now. You're on. Perfect.
I just looked up because I was making, when we were watching the movie, some quotes. The stage where everyone should play a part is part of with Merchant of Venice. So how we're talking that the people played a part and the Jew played his part as the Merchant of Venice. I also have a question of Larry. Larry in the movie, and I thought Pacino was one of the best acting parts I have seen in a long time. Unbelievable. What was it at the end with the shooting of the arrows in the water? What did that signify?
I don't really know. Shooting fish in a barrel, or I don't really know what the director had in mind. But I did want to mention one thing. So I can't answer your question. There's just a lot of unknowns that are not in the play that are in the movie. And but the question I think you also have to ask is, who were really the losers in the play? And obviously there are a couple of losers in the play, because at the very end of the play, when Jessica is talking to Lorenzo, which is in Act 5 now, which is after the trial scene, which is the most dramatic. And as a matter of fact, if you see nothing else, you should just see that trial scene in which, Pacino is just sensational.
Yes.
It's just a compelling kind of scene, one of the most brilliant in all of Shakespeare. But they're talking about lovers of the past. Now you have the Jewish girl who has now given up everything and has stolen money from her father and given it to Lorenzo. And is she really accepted into the Christian world? There are some indications that she's not. She's kind of even ignored in Act 5 by Portia and by some of the other people there. They don't even acknowledge her. And the stories that they tell are of a couple of different lovers. They tell of Dino and Aeneas, and they tell stories of this and this one, of people that have come from different backgrounds, but yet they're tragic stories. So you really don't know. But the two characters that are probably most affected at the end are Antonio, because he is tricked as well. He's tricked by Portia to the extent that he has to almost give up his total friendship with Bassanio. Now, remember at the very beginning of it, people see sometimes there's a homoerotic, relationship between the two, but he is really a loser as well. He becomes a loner outside the community, and Portia tricks him to get the blessing, the fact that he's going to kind of like set aside. And of course, Shylock is tricked as well. So the two guys that are, at the forefront that kind of stood for, commerce and trade. And of course, Shylock is against Antonio, because Antonio had lent money apparently to other people at no interest, which was permitted, I think, at the time. And he was getting into his business, and he's saying, you're hurting my business. And one of the other
That's one of the
comments,
reasons he was upset.
business is everything in Venice. Matter of fact, one person, I forget who it is, even says at the time, we have enough converts. We don't need any converts. Look, they're driving the price of pork up in the play there, which I don't know if that's in the movie, but it's in the play.
Yeah.
Like, everything is based on money. Everything is based on business. And we don't really need any more of these converts.
And that may be why they chose this Jewish character. We'll do one more thing on this. We'll do Noel and then Flossie, and then we'll go check out some of the other ones. No,
Me?
yes, please.
Okay, I came in late, so I missed all the beginning of the class, but watching the play from just a perspective of detail, every minute thing was beautifully done. Actors were magnificent. And I was just spellbound watching it. And it was just incredible. Every scene was like a painting to me, from my point of view. And then all that was going on. So now I'm going to go back and reread the book, but the play was just incredible. And where did the name Shylock come from?
That is a question. I don't know. Anybody know? I have no idea. I should probably look that up.
It has always had a bad connotation. I just wonder where the word came from.
I don't know. That's a good question. Well, we'll come back to that. Something to look up. That's a good question. I don't know. Probably should ask that. So we've gone over Flossie, continue with Shylock, and then we'll go to the next couple other ones. And we could have done this whole thing just on Shakespeare, obviously. Flossie?
Just an aside, after we saw the movie, there were some very interesting interviews. And one of the interviews was with Jeremy Irons, the producer, and Al Pacino. Al Pacino had been asked to be in the play for years. People saw him as Shylock. He wasn't moved. He didn't want to do it. When he read the script of the movie, he very much related with Shylock, saw him as a person that we're talking. And I don't know if Larry's there. Hi, Larry, I see you now. This I found interesting. Some people, there was a group that wanted Brando to play the part. And Brando said, no, this is Al Pacino. I only see him. So people were very much for Al Pacino to play Shylock. And I thought he played it magnificent.
I think Marlon Brando probably, if he put his effort into it, would have been amazing as well. I haven't seen it.
He did with Shakespeare. He did with Julius Caesar.
Yeah, he did Julius Caesar in the 50s, which was pretty good. I have seen that.
So it's fitting that his son did Shakespeare now.
So,
his son, Al Pacino.
oh yeah. his third son, but the one he left. So
Yeah.
Let's take a moment. We already talked about this. We'll talk a little bit. We don't have that much time about some of the other depictions of Jews in this way. Of course, we talked about Canterbury Tales, which brings up the bloodletting idea, or not really bloodletting, about Jews killing Christians for being Christians, basically. And this is in a similar time period. We also have something that may have, been what Shakespeare based his play on, and that is The Jew of Malta, which I have not read. Has anybody ever read that by any chance? Jew of Malta? Okay, I have not read it. It's Christopher Marlowe's. It's Barabbas, who is a psychopath. And he kind of gets to know people, takes them in, and then kills them. And I have not seen the play. I've not read it, but he is presumably doesn't have any of the qualities of Shylock, but I don't know if anybody had read that. I should probably have read that before this. But it's written a few years before Shylock, and I don't think there is. And Michael says Shylock is not a Jewish name. It's a Saxon name, which Goldsmith, very nice. So we already see the Canterbury Tales. We see Chaucer, we see Marlowe's Erebus in the 16th century, showing these anti-Semitic characters, which they may not have realized were anti-Semitic, because obviously Jews were just people that they were almost mythical, I would imagine. They were the bad guy in so many different places that it may have just been assumed. When we get to the Victorian era, though, and we'll kind of skip over because we only have about 10 more minutes, we come to the next, probably second to Shylock, the most well-known character in Jewish character in classic literature is, of course, Fagin from Oliver Twist. Now, remember, there's a really interesting side note to this, because this is already, 19th century, where, we've already had, this is where we see Ivanhoe, which has, although a negative Jewish character, his daughter, and he's not shown in the same kind of light as Shylock or Fagin, and his daughter is actually shown in a positive light. But you come to Fagin, and he is, in many ways, the antithesis of Shylock in that he is all bad. He is a metaphor for evil in many respects. He is not somebody who is redeemable, who is somebody who is even lower than regular Jews. He's referred to as the Jew many times, as was Shylock. And I also make sure people understand we're talking about the book. The movie and the play is very different from the book in the terms of Fagin. If you've seen the movie, especially the 1960s version that won the Academy Award, Fagin, although is a thief, he is kind of like a thief who wants to take care of his kids, and if they don't do something right, he's willing to do something bad, but his nature is basically pretty good. And he cares about his kids, especially the Artful Dodger. And the real bad guy is Bill. And in the book, Bill is even more vicious than Fagin, but Fagin is very happy to kill kids, to keep secrets. He's really happy to do anything he can. He looks like a Jew with the nose. He is very much a caricature. And why is it so different for a lot of us is because, unlike Shylock, after Oliver Twist came out, we're already in a different century. The idea of Fagin being a negative character and anti-Semitic became a discussion. So much so that Dickens himself probably felt the need to include a positive Jewish character in a later book to prove that he was not anti-Semitic, something you would not have seen in the age of Chaucer and Shakespeare. And so he writes a book that I have not read. Again, I wish I'd read all of these, but he writes a book called Rhea. Has anybody read that one? It wasn't nearly as popular, obviously, but he depicts the character of the Jewish character of Rhea. And then I haven't read it, so I do not know anything beyond the fact that it's a positive character that he wrote to dispel any of the notions that he was anti-Semitic. But has anybody read this book? All right, we're going to sign this book to be read like a class. Who's looking at me and who's looking away from their eyes? Like class. Who looks away first? So Fagin is so evil that it really raises the ear of Jews and non-Jews. As much as the book was loved, the Fagin character, for being Jewish, really created a little bit, not that much havoc in his life, but certainly some feeling for him to do some of these things. Any other questions about this? Because we're about finished, but I want to make sure we go to some of the opposite, because by the 18th century and the 19th century, we start to see some positive Jewish characteristics as well.
Quick note about, I'm sorry.
No,
One
please.
quick note about Dickens. Historically, it's been noted that Dickens also had a next door neighbor who was Jewish, with whom he had an excellent relationship. And it makes one wonder whether the character of Fagin wasn't really something of a stock character, with him being Jewish, being a convenience, so that in fact, Dickens probably really did regret the character. And perhaps, I think it wasn't to protect his character that he defended that he wasn't anti-Semitic, but in fact that may very well have been the case, and he just made the mistake of picking the wrong stock.
And
Yeah,
I think
wrong
that
characteristic for a stock character.
very likely, Michael.
Yeah, I read an article about it because I've forgotten much of Oliver Twist in years, and it was published originally as a serial,
right?
And at the end, he took out all the references to the Jew Fagin.
Yes,
you know,
second
like,
printing.
When he rewrote
the number was, I remember it was like 235 times
right.
in the early serial, and then
when the novel came out, he changed it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's true. I think, there's always going to be this debate versus stock character versus anti-Semitism, which is a really difficult debate because we're not living in the mind of anybody to know what they're thinking. But these characters were influenced by previous literature and influenced a lot of later literature. So they're essential for us to understand how this stereotypical idea went from generation to generation. Now, obviously, people who hate Jews, white supremacists, those type of people are going to always hate Jews. There's nothing we can do about it most of the time. But it's the stock characters that convince the regular folk to do it is what becomes so much more worrisome for us. Flossie, and then I think it was Larry. And you're on. Perfect.
Throughout the movie, you kept hearing the word Jew and him referred to as Jew. At certain points, they use the word Hebrew. Is that considered not as derogatory as a word, Jew versus you Hebrew? Because that came in, and Shylock many times said, my tribe. I kept becoming very aware when we used to hear, members of the tribe,
right.
Did that start with Shakespeare? Did Jews come up with that from the tribe?
I do not know. Obviously, the word Jew is based on the word Judah, who is one of the sons of Joseph, but the major tribe that became the tribe of David. And when Babylonians take over Judah and the Jews are sent off into Babylon, the word Hebrew or Israelite is transformed into Jew, which becomes the uniform name for Jews. But Hebrew and Israelites are used throughout the centuries. We'd have to have somebody who was a lot more knowledgeable about the time period to see if Jew meant something worse than Hebrew or meant something worse than Israelite. They are all synonymous in generally, but in different areas, they could have been an insult, one or the other. Larry and then Noel.
Yeah,
that's a good question.
Not Shakespeare. Dickens was very famous for going into the back alleys and the seediest districts and the worst parts of England, looking for characters. And he used to roam around at night, apparently, just trying to see who were the shadiest characters. And they make the best, villains and stories, obviously, at the time. And I did send out, I'm not sure if anybody can prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, but there were stories at the time about the person that they think I don't know if people read this, was the real Fagin at the time. So he was a real character that apparently, or there was a Fagin-like character that people may have known about, kind of like ripped from the headlines kind of thing, like you see in CSI or something else like that. But he did pick all of these characters. You see them all on Toby Jugs, and things like that, that were very caricaturish different kinds of the lower classes that lived on the other side of the Thames River, so to speak, like where the Globe Theater was and where playhouses were and where the illegals were, where you can go on Sunday instead of going to church, you can go and see a show, and get away from the restrictions of London city life.
And it could be just there happened to be a Jewish guy that guy was Jewish, and it just was bad luck for us. No,
Actually, he wasn't Jewish.
he wasn't Jewish. He wasn't the guy.
He is a real character. He wasn't Jewish.
No.
I may have mentioned this before, my father's World War II dog tag, which I have, he came back alive, has H on it for Hebrew, and I never quite understood why, but I still wear it around my neck because it reminds me of him. And I want to say one thing to the class. It has meant so much to me to go back and discuss those books that I read so many years ago, and that it brings new perspectives, and it makes me feel very happy, and it's been so important to me. I want to thank you all.
It's always
And
great having you.
Larry, I'm going to hang up some artwork.
Yes, but she's only going to leave. You should change it each week to have like a roving exhibition just for Larry.
I did want to mention one thing that
Larry, we'll go to.
Even though the Jews were absent from England from like 1290 to basically, Oliver Cromwell's time, the 1650s, or whenever they were permitted back, I think the people there did have a memory of the Jewish history. And I think that, there were Jewish massacres. I remember we were in the city of York, and there was a tower in the city of York that has a plaque on the outside of it where I think, they entombed 100 Jewish people at the time, which was a large number of Jews in the city. And so I think there is this memory that did take place, even though they were absent in Shakespeare's time, and of Jews having this kind of, maybe even dating back to Christ and, being the betrayer of Christ and Judas and those kind of things. But I think it's still, those things die hard, so to speak.
Obviously, because it's been 200, 300 years since the last Jew was kicked out of England. So that memory is long and part of the DNA possibly. And again, what you'd see in the 19th century, you'd also see probably a lot more of, as Jews are becoming more and more integrated in society, there's a pushback going all the way, we talked about, to the Dreyfus Affair, this pushback of Jews entering society versus staying out of society, versus not just Jews, but the lower classes as well, and how Europe has a lot more difficulty dealing with this than America does because we don't have that history. And so you might think if we hadn't heard Stewart talk, that this Dickens is kind of pushing back on allowing, look, why can we allow these Jews to integrate with us? They're all like Fagin, which may have been the case, even though he didn't intentionally do so. And that's why he wrote the next book, because he realized it afterwards. Michael. Oh, you're on mute, Michael.
No, I just move my hands a lot. I'm sorry.
Okay, good. Oh, so you're Jewish. Are you Jewish by any chance?
Maybe you ought to get some flypaper, Michael.
One of my students one of my students in fourth grade came up to me and said, "Mr. Haas, if we tie your hands together, will class be over?" It took me a second to understand what she was saying.
People have said that to me at work.
Yeah.
But let's go over the two. Larry, before we get to you, let's go with the two examples of positive Jews in literature. Some believe the very first positive Jewish character is not published until 1779, Nathan the Wise, which talks about a Jew, a Muslim, and a Christian getting together in friendship during the Third Crusade. So that is a long time, 1779. is, although it was performed apparently before that. So, but in the 18th century, we get really a fairly well-known character in the book, and I always pronounce it wrong, Daniel Deronda. Has anybody ever read this book by any chance? George Eliot. And so here we actually see a character that is not only very positive, he's Christian, he looks like he's Christian, finds out he's Jewish at the end, but he's also a Zionist. He's a very big supporter of the land of Israel this is before Dreyfus and before Herzl. This is during the time where the Rothschilds were starting to think about sponsoring the first Jews to move back to Israel. And so it's a very positive look at this gentleman who falls in love with a Jewish woman, and it's a really wonderful family. And at the end, he finds out he's Jewish, and that's now very supportive of this gentleman who he admired, who wanted. And it's really, I haven't read it. I've just read the synopsis. Obviously, I should read that because I am a rabbi, but we have decided that Sheila's going to read that one. Noel, you're going to read Rhea. Stuart, you're going to read Nathan the Wise. So those are the assignments. Jeff and Larry.
Rabbi, what book did you just mention? I missed the title of it.
Daniel Deronda. It's by George Eliot, published in the 1870s. It was in like all the other books. It was published in different parts. And then in 1876, and then I don't remember when the book came out a few years later. So, and it's set in about that time period in 1860s Germany.
What am I supposed to read?
I was kidding. It was a joke. It was a joke, Noel. I was saying I don't want to teach myself, so I'm assigning it to all of you guys. Are there any other characters? Again, we did not bring in, I mean, obviously we had to cut this thing short. We could have gone on another couple hours on just Shakespeare. Larry?
Not a character, but just, it seems to me also one of the other things that has hurt the Jews is that their association with communism. They were one of the leaders of the communist revolt against the Tsar. They were one of the leaders of establishing communism. And, you hear a lot of even the things today, Jewish and communism, sometimes they go together, those words. And I think that has propelled the anti-Semitism, even in a country like America, capitalist society and socialism, communism is a red flag that goes up, and you do see that. And I think even until there were Jewish communities that were established in the Bronx in New York, and these Jewish cooperatives that had communist signs on their buildings and things of that nature, they were very prominent in it until Stalin came along and basically persecuted a lot of the Jews. But the founding of communism is kind of related to Judaism with Karl Marx and with many of the people who were the philosophers for it. And I think that's maintained its relationship, I think, among people that still feel Jews and communism go together.
And it's amazing. It's like doing research to prove the point you think. That's the worst way to do research. I believe this, so I'm going to keep researching until I can prove it, ignoring all the other research that says otherwise. And I think a lot of that is what anti-Semitism is. We don't like Jews. Let's find the reason. And the reason will change throughout time. The money-lending Jew issue is still there, but it's not as prevalent as it used to be. I hear a lot more about the Israel persecuting Jew, or that's the number one I hear, or the Jew who doesn't believe in Christianity. I mean, again, you can always find a way to persecute. Communism certainly was a major one until World War II, and that Jews were supporting it. And then obviously after World War II, again, also. And it's no small coincidence that the only person really who went to jail for treason for support of was a Jewish guy, and then the only people killed for that were 2 Jewish spies. And so you can always find a way. And in this age, it's a lot harder, though, to navigate because there's so much literature. There's, Jews make fun of Jews, other people make fun of themselves. What is hateful? What is funny? What goes far too far? Who's trying to push against, bring these things out into the open for good reasons, and who's doing it for bad reasons? Michael.
I just want to make a point about the Rosenbergs. To me, I mean, I've read a lot about them, and I'm kind of thinking they were guilty. But the only reason they wound up being executed is because the judge at the trial was Jewish, and he wanted to show that he was an American and that he wouldn't put up with people being traitors. And that's, that's a whole other story about Jews trying to prove themselves.
Right, and it's the same thing with, what's his name, Prime Minister of England. Never mind, I can't remember. The Jewish Prime Minister of England. There's only been one.
Israeli.
Exactly, thank you.
Yeah.
Felt that same need. Again, but you only need to prove yourself if there's an issue out there. So it's almost as the issue caused him, and I didn't realize the judge. So these are all issues but in classic literature, there's so few comparatively in the number of books written that you can really look at all these issues and see common threads and wonder, is it anti-Semitism or is it just accepted behavior? Did Shakespeare and Chaucer and Dickens really hate Jews, or is it just they're writing and this is something everybody's going to understand?
One study that I haven't seen and would love to see is some comparison to the frequency of really anti-characters, just as we can select books with anti-Semitic characters. I wonder how many books there are with fill in the blank
Right.
characters, and we may find it's the same proportion, and it's only our sensitivity.
Yeah.
There. A quick little note: Karen had a really interesting experience on Monday. Someone who works for us, who does cleaning for us, is from Uruguay, and by and large, she's a pretty bright woman. Somehow, I don't know what the discussion was, but the question of the Holocaust came up. She knew, because of her education in Uruguay, zero about it. She was a denier. She had no awareness whatever of this having occurred during World War II.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, again,
she's just not educated there. And I started wondering if, in some sense, we might be better off if we just didn't educate about any of this stuff.
Yeah. And when it comes to the anti-Semitic views, it's also that there wasn't that many outsiders in society that you could do this to. Jews were one of the few known outsiders in that world. So, making them the bad guy is almost natural. Flossie, did you want to?
The only ones who survived for that many years.
Right, exactly.
Next week is at Sheila's house, am I correct?
Right, so we'll go over that next week.
We're doing Jews of the Caribbean? Is that
Well, what we're going to do basically is we're going to have an hour-long discussion on, is it the Jews of the Caribbean or do we call it the Jews of the Caribbean? That's the entire discussion. How do you pronounce this word? Because I always said Caribbean until the movie came out, and now I say Caribbean. I love the first one, did not like any of the others. So we're going to look at Jews in the Caribbean. Sheila, would you give us any other ideas?
Can I ask everyone to please shoot me an email if you're coming, so that I know how many people will be here next week?
And we'll put that on the notice that goes
We
out.
don't have a mailing list anymore, do we? An
Yeah,
email
I
list?
created a new one, and I'm going to send it out to all of them.
Okay,
Remember, I went over it with you.
but I didn't see the completed one. Okay,
Yeah, I'll send it to you.
okay, thank you.
So basically the edits you told me. Noel,
As a Southern girl, it's Jews of the Caribbean.
okay.
That's the way I said.
And we're going to look at, the synagogue and the synagogues there, the people there. Obviously, we have a deep connection because Mikveh Israel's the first Mikveh Israel in the New World was not ours. We're the second. The first one was in the Caribbean. And so we'll look at that as well.
By the
Okay.
way, Karen is doing Jews of South America
Oh, wow.
Tuesday night.
One more time, would you tell us when?
Tuesday night,
Tuesday night
on Zoom.
on Zoom for
Shalom.
Oseh Shalom. Which Tuesday? Like next week?
Next Tuesday. So
All right, great.
if anyone is interested,
What time's it at?
notwithstanding, drop me an email and I'll send you a link.
What time is it at?
7 or 7:30, 7, I think.
All right. So if anybody has any questions about that, look on the Oseh Shalom website or call or email Stuart. So we're going to do Jews of the Caribbean next week. And then the week after, we're going to do another sage from the many faces of God. Did anybody have anybody they wanted us to do? We did Harold Kushner. The next one in here is Richard Levy. I'm happy to do him. He was actually we could also do Judith Plaskow, of course, who's probably one of the most important female liturgists of the 20th century. Anybody okay with either of those?
Yeah, can we do both?
We could try and do both. Yeah, we'll do Richard Levy and Judith Plaskow. They're very different. Obviously, she's more well known because of this
Can you
liturgy.
repeat that, Rabbi? What are the names?
Richard Levy, or it's actually Richard Levy. I'm just so used to saying, and we'll probably just start with Richard Levy. If we get to Judith Plaskow, if not, we'll do her next. And I can say that Richard Levy was probably one of the nicest people I've ever met. He was the dean of my rabbinical school when I was there. And I actually wanted to call him, and I hadn't talked to him in years. And then I looked up online for his information. I didn't realize he had passed away. So, but really just a terrific person. Flossie?
I just want to tell you, your subject next week is very apropos because in December, we're going on a cruise to the
Oh,
Caribbean. So we appreciate it. It's like you'll be there with us, Rabbi, as we're
Yeah.
making notes and doing.
It's like that because I've decided to go on that cruise with you. I'll be in the cabin next door.
Or on the balcony. Huh?
Yeah,
Okay.
probably will be. The lowest levels, they call it the dungeon. That's where I'll be. A pleasure as always studying with you guys. It's such an incredible. We could actually do this again with this and look at some. I mean, there were so many things to talk about, but we obviously wanted to talk mostly about Shylock, and which we did. So thank you. You guys are so knowledgeable.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you,
And
Rabbi.
we'll see you next week.
Thank
We're
you,
going to
Rabbi.
be meeting outside. You need us to bring anything, Sheila?
No, a chair.
Okay, bring chairs.
A chair.
I can bring the
Yeah.
chairs also. I can bring them. All right. Thanks,
All right,
guys.
thank you.
Stay safe.
Thank you.
We'll see you next week.
Bye.
Also,
Bye.
anybody thinking of coming to services, Saturday morning, their services are going to be recorded, so you have to watch them online because of the Rock and Roll Marathon.
Bye-bye.
Bye,
Okay,
guys. Stay
bye-bye.
safe.